I'm great. How about you?
Hanging in there with both hands.
It's cold today, Rabbi.
Very cold.
It's cold for Florida. It's not real cold.
Yeah, for Florida.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that cold. But
And New York is 28.
my son says it's going to feel like below zero tomorrow.
Maybe if I'm in the swimming pool.
Oh, Lord.
Well, when you've lived here as long as I have no blood left. So, if it drops below 60, I'm in a winter coat.
Yeah, I could imagine. It's very cold for me.
No.
All right. Let's get that over there.
Okay.
Like it's working fine. Okay. Looks like I got everything just about where it needs to be. All the different bits in all the different places. Check our time. And we're good. Maybe just give it one more minute for people to log in, and then we will dive in. Hope everybody's hungry because we're talking about eating tonight.
Mm-hmm. That's what I'm doing.
Same here.
That's good. It's we don't get to eat in person so much anymore, but we can still share the feeling of studying and eating together. All right. Why don't we go ahead and get things moving so that we don't lose too much time. Once again, good afternoon and or good evening to everyone, depending upon how north you are and how dark it's getting for you. We are going to start the topic of Kashrut today. That is to say, the topic of keeping kosher. Now, keeping kosher is a little bit of a misunderstood part of Judaism. Obviously, being careful about what we eat and choosing to eat the things that God has told us to eat is very, very prominent in Jewish identity and Jewish culture. But it is not just one thing. It is a collection of different activities that center and revolve around food and food preparation, yes, but has much deeper meaning and significance. The same way that if we talk about Jewish, the Jewish responsibility to be honest, that covers a huge range of different activities, all of which have many different impacts on our spirit and our life. So too, with what we call keeping kosher or kashrut as a topic, it covers a range of different topics, a range of ideas, a range of practices, and a range of effects. So I want to start, before we get into the nuts and bolts, with why we should care and do this at all. I do find that for many people, the concept of being careful with what we eat is perfectly normal. After all, most people are a little careful with what they eat. Most people are not going to eat out of the dumpster if they can avoid it. Most people are not going to eat food that is obviously spoiled if they can avoid it. Most people are not going to eat animals dead on the side of the road if they can avoid it. But beyond that, people can have different feelings about it. And well, we're going to see that the reasons why we don't eat from dumpsters, spoilage, or dead animals on the side of the road has nothing to do with why we don't keep or why we don't eat things, why we keep the rules of kashrut, why we follow the laws of being kosher according to the Torah. So let's try and untangle what kashrut is and isn't and why we do it before we get into some of the meat of the matter. Sorry for the joke. So why? Well, we can start off with what God tells us at the beginning, because God does not go into a great deal of detail, but in the section of the Torah that deals with some of the laws of keeping kosher, there is this preamble, this introduction, this summary, if you will, that happens in multiple ways throughout the section, but this is one I thought was most typical. I am the Lord your God. Sanctify yourself and be holy, for I am holy. For For I am the Lord that brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. As you can see, the word holy seems to be rather important in this concept. And indeed, in Judaism, we consider that Kashrut, along with the keeping of the other commandments, all have an effect on the holiness that we are able to achieve in our life. Now, holiness is one of those great words that everybody knows, but we don't all agree on what it means. Many times people will use the word holy just to mean it's wonderful. But that's not exactly what Judaism means when it says holy. When we talk about something being kadosh, about it being holy, or something that has holiness, kedusha, what we are talking about is that there is a special connection that moves us from a base understanding and behavior in this world to a higher understanding and connection to not only this world, but also the world of the Spirit, the world of God. So this is an elevation that isn't just about good, it isn't just about nice, or even just about right or wrong, but it is about a particular perspective and feeling that happens within the spirit, the life of a person who is pursuing a life of holiness. But the devil is always in the details, as we say, or actually in Judaism, it's more God in the details because we don't believe in the devil the way the Western pop culture believes in it. So that means we're going to have to dig a little deeper to understand how this happens, how this effect of holiness is achieved in all the commandments, but for tonight, specifically within the commandments of keeping kosher. So by looking at some of the other explanations and some of the other teachings from our different sages in different generations, hopefully we'll see different perspectives on how this transforms us and raises us towards holiness. So we're going to begin with Rambam himself. Maimonides, as you all know, is one of my favorites, and he gives wonderful explanations. And one of the ones that he gives in this particular case is that we keep kosher because it was a commandment. That is to say, God gave us a commandment. Indeed, as we saw in our verse in Leviticus, God reminds us that God is the one who brought us out of the land of Egypt. And that is not just reminding us of history for history's sake. It's reminding us that God has earned our allegiance. God has earned our willingness to follow the rules that God has given. The same way that if you were living in some place in the ancient world and a king came in and got rid of all of the bandits and wild animals that were harassing and hurting you, you would owe him a little bit of allegiance for having made your group a little better. And when he said, from now on, this is the way we're going to handle lost and found, business practices, whatever, you would be inclined to follow those rules. Kashrut is a rule. The rule is given by a legitimate authority, nothing more legitimate than God. Therefore, fulfilling the commandment for itself seems like a good idea. Now, Rambam goes into a little more depth on this, so if you'll let me read for a moment. It is correct for a person to investigate the laws of the Holy Torah and to know their purpose to the best of his abilities. So it's perfectly fine to wonder and to think about and try and investigate why we do what we do. If he does not, however, find a reason or purpose in something, it should not be light in his eyes. He should not reject the commandments because he does not know their reasons. And he should not attribute false ideas to God or think about them as a profane matters. So if you are investigating a rule, for example, one of the most commonly cited bizarre rules in Judaism is that we do not wear garments that have a mixture of wool and linen. Just those two. People often misunderstand that. We don't wear a blend of those two fabrics within the same warp and woof. So why? Why not? Well, we can hypothesize because God does not tell us directly in the Torah, and indeed there are many different suggestions. But if you have heard all the different theories of why we do not wear that type of fabric, and you are not convinced, none of them grabs you and says, aha, this makes sense, this is the reason, you still have to do it, or not do it in that particular case. We don't wait for understanding before we perform the commandment. The same way that we don't wait for a child to learn the value of vaccinations, the values of brushing their teeth, the value of going to school and learning geography before we do all those things, so too, we do not wait until we have decided we understand the reasons and the benefits for the commandments before we do them. They are commandments, we do them because they are commandments, and we keep investigating to try and learn more, but we don't wait before we begin to fulfill. Very important principle in Jewish life in general. However, we do still get to investigate. So that's why we're not going to finish right here. We do have other suggestions, but even if none of the suggestions you hear tonight are compelling to you from a moral, ethical, spiritual standpoint, hopefully this one at least is. That keeping kosher is a collection of the commandments that make up the Torah, and even if only for that reason, they are worthy of being followed. But let's talk about some of the other explanations. So Abarbanel, one of the great philosophers of the late Middle Ages, he wants to give us an idea that keeping kosher is good for us, but not maybe in the way that you think. God forbid that I should believe that the reason for forbidden foods is medicinal. Right? It's not good for us in the same way your doctor tells you that fiber is good for you. For were it so, the book of God's law would be in the same class as any of the minor brief medical books. Back in their days, medical books weren't very long because they didn't have a whole lot of true medical knowledge. Furthermore, our own eyes see that people who eat pork and insects and such are well and alive and healthy at this very day. And it is not, the foods that are forbidden for us are not forbidden because eating them would make us sick. That is not why God told us not to eat them. Moreover, there are more dangerous animals and poisonous herbs which are not mentioned at all in the Torah. You can eat a buffalo. You can't catch a buffalo so easily. And if you go out to the buffalo with your wonderful knife for doing the slaughter, and you ask the buffalo to hold still while you perform shtita on it, you're probably going to get trampled by it and its friends. But the Torah doesn't tell us not to try. The Torah says, yeah, buffalo is technically kosher. So we have to understand that it's not there just for our superficial benefit. All of which points to the conclusion that the law of God did not come to heal bodies and seek their material welfare, but to seek the health of the soul and cure its illness. So when we are keeping the laws of Kashrut, along with the other mitzvot, that is our focus tonight, we are not just feeding our body or taking care of our body, although of course it will do that if we are being reasonable in how we follow them, not trying to go out and hug a buffalo, but we are actually doing something that is beneficial to our spiritual self, to our inner self, our deeper self, and that has an impact that goes beyond our cholesterol levels or other things like that. Does that make sense? Any questions or comments at that point? All right, and let's move on to another option, or perhaps a parallel option. These are not meant to be contradictory. So, Guide for Perplexed, another copy of Rambam's work, this more philosophical, implies that keeping kosher, indeed all the commandments, all have some element in them that is improving the nature of me, of the character, your person itself. Every commandment, he says, of the 613 commandments, either imparts to us a true philosophy, a correct idea, eradicates a false philosophy, makes sure we don't end up with the wrong idea, enforces a rule of social justice so that we have a fair and good society, nullifies injustice to prevent a bad society, bestows noble character traits, elevates us in the personality and character that we have, or warns against evil traits, keeps us away from behaving in bad ways. If we look at all of the different commandments, we will find that all of them, in one way or in multiple ways, are providing some sort of support to these different aspects. so that when we are keeping kosher, we could very minimally say that it is bestowing noble character traits on us because it is teaching us patience. It is teaching us discipline. It is teaching us self-control and self-restraint. It is teaching us to be satisfied and happy with what we have. It is avoiding the negative traits of being rapacious, of going out and aggressively taking whatever we feel like. It is keeping us from being overly gluttonous and just eating things because they taste good with no consideration beyond the pleasure we receive from eating. By keeping kosher, we are also, as we talked about before, keeping the commandments as a sign of our allegiance to God, which is reinforcing the proper idea that God is the true God who has the right to command us. It is also teaching us to stay away from the idea of ignoring the commands, that false philosophy that we can do what we want because, as many people believed in the ancient world and still believe, unfortunately, in the modern, that God doesn't care about what we do. Keeping kosher helps with all of those different aspects of our character and more besides, as we will see. It also can be said to shape our spirit. This following teaching comes from Ramban, also of the late Middle Ages. The blood he talks about, which is one of the major issues when it comes to what is kosher and what is not. The blood is the nephesh of the animal. The nephesh is the life spirit of the animal, in which we find its natural instincts. Therefore, we are forbidden to mix animal blood with our own blood, for we receive the Torah. Right? The Torah tells us how to live, and one of the things it makes clear is we don't live like an animal. To eat the blood of an animal would be to try and emulate the activity, the spirit of an animal, which, nothing against animal, is not able to achieve the same elevated position and existence in life. For us, our lives have to remain untainted from the lower elements so that we can better comprehend higher concepts. We are commanded to be merciful, but if we were to eat blood, our souls would become closer to the animals, and it would create coarseness and cruelty. Again, with an animal, the animal eating another animal is not considered cruel. That's what animals do. But for a human who understands and knows better, for us to be eating like an animal from any animal that we feel like and to be drinking and draining its blood, well, that would be teaching us to be cruel. There is a great paradox that as humans become more and more sophisticated and more moral, we actually become more likely to learn bad lessons from what would be considered normal behavior if we were an animal. There's nothing bad about the animal doing it, but for us to imitate it would be to shape us in the wrong direction for our moral and ethical development. Unlike parts of the meat, the blood is not simply digested by the body, but remains as is. This was in his belief in that age, and thereby affects the very essence of a person. This is the meaning of the verse, for the nephesh of the flesh is in the blood, also taken from Vayikra, from the book of Leviticus. Now, his medical and biological science may not have been 100% correct, but the metaphor that he is trying to share with us is still very true. That if we allow ourselves to eat in a way that we recognize as being how an animal eats, eating what we want, when we want, and eating an animal in a way that pulls in that attitude of an animal, that is going to change us in a way that it wouldn't change one animal from another, but will cause a deterioration of the human spirit because we know better and we know that we should do better. Indeed, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, also one of the great rabbis of the 1800s who tried to help people in the modern world understand the benefits of traditional Judaism, teaches as follows. Just as the external temple, meaning the temple of Jerusalem, which represents your holy mission and to which you should sanctify yourself, becomes desecrated by impurity, so are these foods impure and unfit for your spirit, as far as they are all of them the living place of activity for your own being, which is summoned unto holiness. If you have eaten them, not only touch but absorb them into your system, you may be more nourished and better fed, but the animal instinct will be aroused more strongly within you, and your body becomes more blunted as an instrument of the spirit. Your heart, instead of being holy, instead of only striving for holiness, namely your sublimity over everything animal-like, is drawn down to the animal, or become the more apathetic and dulled. Your spirit is now faced with a fiercer battle and is less equipped for the fight. So, despite having replenished the body, it actually deteriorates our spirit and makes the struggle to be a stronger, better, and more powerful spiritual person even harder, because we have allowed ourselves to act as an animal. Again, this corrupts our sense of self and our sense of mission. Questions or comments up to this point?
I thought about the pomegranate and how there's the 613 pods in there.
Yes.
I wonder if that's, not a coincidence, of course, but another reminder of, eating and keeping a certain way.
Absolutely. When we look at the natural world around us and we look at the foods around us, we find reminders in every nook and cranny. All over, we find little hints and little indicators guiding us towards our better spirit, our better direction. But we have to pay attention, and then we have to listen to the reminders that we've been given.
Yes, sir. I thought that was awesome.
Another reason for keeping kosher, again coming from the words of Rambam, is that keeping kosher keeps us away from many of the practices that were done in the ancient world by the idol worshippers, by the pagans. And no, he argues, that blood was very unclean in the eyes of Zaba. Now, Zaba was a type of idolatry back in those days. Yet they ate from the blood nevertheless, believing that it was the food of the spirits. So the same way that we see it as the food that has the spirit of an animal in it and keep away from it, they saw it as the food that has the spirit of an animal with it, and so took it. Right? Yet they ate from the blood nevertheless, believing that it was the food of the spirits. When one ate it, he was symbolically, they believed, joining the spirits and would be able to tell the future. So they saw this as being some mystical, magical practice, which of course we do not believe in. And so by remembering that others would use certain things in a very negative way, by us refraining from it, it allows us to strengthen and overcome those temptations, those problems, not only by the not eating of the blood, but by not engaging in fortune telling, soothsaying, and all the other things that are going along with that. This is very similar to if somebody was, for example, raised next door to a person that was an alcoholic. They might, as they get older, stay as far away from excessive drinking as possible because they have seen the damage that it can cause. So too, if somebody has seen the damage that idolatry can cause, then staying away from those practices would make a lot of sense as a way of preventing similar problems in your own community or your own self. There are a lot of other reasons that people have suggested of why we keep the specific rules of kashrut that we keep, but they're not real. That is to say, they are not the real reasons. They're not the points that were ever made by our ancestors, our sages, and certainly are not hinted at even by God. So, for example, some people will say, well, the reason Jews don't eat pork is because back in the middle, in the ancient world, in the desert, they didn't know how to cook pork safely, and they were afraid of trichinosis. Not true. Everybody knew how to cook pork, and everybody in the ancient world knew that cooking pork required longer cooking to make sure that it was safe to eat. And across the world, where pigs of all varieties were eaten gladly by people, people were not dropping dead of trichinosis all the time. And indeed, there are similar problems in many other types of animals that are kosher. You can get sick from eating beef that was allowed to spoil, or lamb, or poultry, or anything else that was allowed to spoil. And not handled according to proper techniques. And really until the modern times, it was hard to handle meat successfully without the risk of some problem or contamination. So when God told us not to eat pork, it wasn't just to keep us away from trichinosis. Some people will say, well, but you know, the shellfish, when we don't eat the oysters and the clams and the shrimp, that was because in the ancient world, they didn't know about the different cycles of life, and they didn't know that sometimes shellfish were healthy and sometimes they were dangerous. And so they just said, stay away altogether. Again, not true. You go to any society, no matter how far from modern health standards and hygiene and understanding of marine biology, and they all figured it out quite easily. You can go to every island nation that is desperately dependent upon shellfish, and people are not dropping dead every year in mass numbers because they don't know when it's safe and not safe to eat an oyster. They know. They have it figured out. People who lived in the ancient world were not stupid. If they had been, they would have died off and we would never have gotten here. So keeping us kosher is not about avoiding bad shellfish. So they say, all right, it had no health benefit. It wasn't about the safety and food safety. So it must just be superstition. Right? It was just, no, it was bad luck to eat these things. It was, not what we're supposed to do because the big bad, voodoo god is going to get mad at you for eating this. No, Jews never believed that there was some superstitious connection between what we ate and what would happen. It wasn't as though when we ate beef, we only had good luck, and when we ate pork, we had bad luck. We knew, both for ourselves as well as watching the people around us, that choosing what to eat or not eat had no bearing whatsoever on any sort of superstitious activity. It was as ineffectual as worrying about a black cat walking in front of you or throwing salt over the shoulder. It was never presented as being some superstitious activity. So people would say, but people keep kosher is because people keep kosher. That is to say, it's just an ignorant following of tradition, that people do what their parents did, and their parents do what their grandparents did, and the grandparents do all the way back, but no one knows why, and it doesn't really matter to anyone. It's just, this is what we do, and it's done. This last one is actually a little true, unfortunately. It is a little true that there are many people who will avoid certain foods and who will keep kosher in certain ways, not because they are embracing the commandments, not because they are making a conscious spiritual decision at that moment that allows them to develop their character and to help their spirit grow in holiness, but just because that's the way they were raised. It's just what they do. They have no conscious choice of what they are doing. It's just, this is how we do things. The same way that somebody might look at a new dish, for example, sushi, much of which is kosher. A lot of it also is not, but imagine someone's looking at sushi without the issue of kashrut around it. And some people would say, oh, maybe I'll try that. And a lot of other people would say, I've never eaten raw fish. I'm not going to eat raw fish. And they're not making a decision about the raw fish. They're making a decision only to conform to the traditional menu items they've already had. Judaism does not tell us to keep kosher just because we always have. We should keep kosher at least for that reason. Of course, I'm not saying that you should stop. Like I said way back at the beginning, we keep a commandment even if we're not 100% sure why. But understand that there is much deeper benefit and a much deeper meaning if we are willing to investigate further. And inertia, just going along with what's always been done without ever thinking about it longer than that, is one, not going to carry you very far, and two, it is not going to benefit you as much as giving yourself time to at least think and feel what you are doing, even in the most rudimentary and beginning kind of ways, compared to just doing it for tradition's sake. Any questions or additional comments about the whys before we get into some of the details of how? Let me just take another quick sip. Okay, so let's get into some more nitty-gritty. So the basics of keeping kosher are not actually that hard. If you're looking at this slide right now, this is pretty much it. Now, there are a lot of details that go with many of these aspects, and we'll talk about them. But if you can remember these main points, you will have the basic outline of what it is to keep kosher. Like I said, there are different details and many commandments are sort of overlapping in this summary, but this is a very core summary of what it means to keep kosher. 1, eat only beasts, only animals with cloven hooves. That means the hoof part on the bottom of their foot, the split goes all the way through. So for example, if you look at a horse's hoof, it does not get broken. And if you look at a sheep's hoof or a cow's hoof, it is broken the whole way through. Ignore the bottom part of my hand, right? It's just a two sides and split down the middle. The animal has to chew its cud, right? That means it has multiple stomachs. And when it first eats, it goes into one stomach and then it comes up and it's digested a bit more and goes into the other, back and forth. And you can only eat from those animals, the most famous of which are cows and sheep, after they have been properly slaughtered. We'll talk about what that means more, I believe it's in next week's class. And they had their blood drained. Talked about the blood a little bit, we'll talk more. And certain fats, certain parts of the middle of its belly fat, and the section around the sciatic nerve, which is part of the hip meat, have been removed. Now, here's the thing. You're living in the modern world and you go in and you look for a kosher piece of meat and you're buying meat that is certified as kosher, all of these things have already been taken care of. It's already been done for you. Your little cellophane wrapper is done because it came from a kosher animal. It was slaughtered correctly. The blood has already been drained and the original butcher has already removed any of those portions that were not allowed to eat. It could not be easier in the modern world. It's a little harder here in Orlando because there aren't quite as many kosher places to find kosher meat. Personally, we usually go to the Winn-Dixie that is in Fern Park, that is just off the 1792, next to the Goodwill and behind the Dunkin' Donuts, to give you a few landmarks. And they actually have a pretty nice little kosher meat section back in the cooler section. But it really is quite easy because it's already been taken care of. 2, for birds, any bird not on the Torah's short list of forbidden ones is fine after it's been properly slaughtered and prepared. What does this mean? It means you'll be eating chicken, you'll be eating turkey. Those are perfectly fine. There aren't a lot of other birds. Duck is a favorite of mine, but it's hard to find kosher duck because it's not as commercially viable. It's not sold as much. But chicken, ducks, turkey, those are going to be your main types of food. And guess what? Those are the main type of birds that most people eat. Pigeons, by the way, and doves are also kosher. It's just a little harder to find those as well. I have not seen those easily prepared in a modern supermarket. Well, I think in my life. 3, moving on to fish. If the fish has fins and scales, you're good, which pretty much means anything that looks like a regular fish, with a few exceptions, is fine. So bass and trout, no problem at all. You want to eat catfish? We got a problem, because catfish don't actually have scales. They have a very smooth outer skin, and therefore they're not okay. If you want to eat things like eel or shark, not okay, because they don't have proper fins, proper scales. Indeed, this is also where things like oysters, clams, shrimp, lobster, octopus all fall off the menu as well, because they come from the ocean and they don't have fins and scales. There are some locusts, some types of bugs that are kosher as well from the Torah. However, although they don't need any additional preparation, just like fish don't need additional preparation, you do have to be very careful of which species you are grabbing. And that is something that you would need to talk to a locust expert about. I am not one. So do not bring me bugs and ask me if they are kosher, because I will tell you, don't eat it, because I cannot identify a perfectly proper kosher locus because it's not something that was ever shown to me as, look, this is what we're looking for. There are people, if you are very interested in doing this, there are people who can, and I can even show you where to find out more about that if you are interested in eating kosher bugs. Plants and minerals, everything's fine. Doesn't mean it's all safe. I don't go around eating arsenic or other things like that. But plants and minerals, salt, and all that's fine. Nothing else needed to be done. If it's straight plant, straight mineral, you're good. Meat and milk, meat as the type that we talked about as being kosher, and then milk also has to come from a kosher animal. Those are all fine on their own, but we don't mix them together, as we will talk about in more detail. So I'm going to go into more detail on all of that. So unless you have a question about the broad summary, I'm going to move on.
Rabbi,
Yes.
did you mention the fish, the catfish, or no?
Yes, catfish is not kosher.
Ese no
Okay,
bacalao.
so you can't eat that.
You
It should be
cannot-
eaten.
No
Okay.
catfish. Exactly.
Catfish. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
No bacalao. Mm-mm.
I have
All
to
right.
ask, Rabbi.
So a way to think about this is to think about it as sort of a bundle of different mitzvot. Like I said, there are mitzvot regarding the kosher species, plants, bugs, fish, birds, animals. These are all different things that have different rules about them. I've got two more questions coming through chat. Just hold on a second. Feel free to unmute and ask the questions, or if your microphone's not working, feel free to type them in chat.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay, first question is to Jose. Did they mean catfish or codfish? Like cod? I didn't get it.
I think they were asking, I was answering about catfish, C-A-T, cat, like, meow, meow, catfish, because that is not kosher. But cod, C-O-D, is kosher. That's a perfectly fine fish.
And the second question I have is the following about the mixture of dairy and meat.
Yes.
Some people confuse, and I have been asked this. What about the mixture of chicken with dairy?
Hold on to that. We are going to be talking about that later this afternoon, or later this evening. So the short answer is we do not mix dairy with poultry, with chicken or other types of birds. But why that is, I'll talk about in a little bit.
Thank you.
Good questions. So like I said, these are really bundles of mitzvot. There are the different species, each one of which is a mitzvah. Then there is the requirements or non-requirements for how we kill the animal. And each part of that is a different step. And then there is the kosher preparation, the draining of the blood, the removal of certain fats from certain animals, the gid hanashe, that's the sciatic nerve. We'll talk about that more in part 2, and the actual kosher cooking. Again, the separation of meat and milk, which we'll talk about in part 2 in more detail. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the first two bundles as we talk about these mitzvot. So when we think about what we can eat, basically we are moving from big things, big categories that lots and lots of things are okay, down to smaller and smaller and smaller groups. And in the process, we are actually moving from things that are very different from us towards things that are more and more and more similar to us. So at the farthest outer red edge, the things that are most different from us are plants and rocks and minerals, right? Me and a tree, it's hard to see the similarities between us. I know there are, and we both have DNA and then all those other wonderful things, and that's great to think about, that we come from originally the same source. But when I'm walking down the street and I see a flower, I don't react to it the same way I would even to a fish. Right? A fish with its motion, its life, its eyes, even insects in the same category, those are more similar to me, and I can feel a relationship to them more easily than I can to plants or minerals. And indeed, the limits on what we can eat seem to get narrower and narrower the closer we get to home, the closer we get to ourselves. And again, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that how we treat things that are like us will often change our moral behavior for how we treat other human beings as well. If we can be mean to an animal, then it is likely that we will learn to be mean to other humans. And if we can learn to be kind or understanding and properly respectful to an animal, even while eating it, then chances are we will be kinder, more respectful to humans, but not eating them, of course. So moving from fish, where there is a huge range that we are allowed to eat, we then move to birds, to fowl, and the range of options gets smaller. And the requirements of what we have to do to be able to slaughter and prepare it becomes harder, right? Making a fish kosher is easy. You pull it out of the river, it's ready to go. A bird, the slaughter process and preparation is a little harder. And then to actual land animals, that is the narrowest category of all. Remember the split hoof and the chewing its cud, which is a very small category of all the animals walking the earth, and leaves us with pretty much things like cows, sheep, deer, buffalo, as I mentioned, a very narrow range of animals that we are able to eat, with many requirements of how they have to be killed, drained of blood, and their bodies prepared before we are allowed to eat them. And of course, the limitation on mixing that with milk. So again, as we move up or move closer in this circle, the available menu items become smaller and the work needed to prepare them goes up and becomes higher. And all of this, again, is to give us this reflection and this mindfulness of what it is that we are eating. Everyone good on that?
Yes, very good.
Yes.
So let's go back and we'll just talk a little bit more closely about each of these categories. So the species, plants. God said, see, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that is seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. Back in Genesis, God says to all of humans, eat plants. They're available. They're everywhere. They're great. No problem. All plants are by themselves kosher, right? Every plant is 100% kosher to start. How they get prepared, if someone wants to cook their kale in bacon fat, now we have a problem. But the plants themselves are all fine. So that's why sometimes we do need to investigate, if it's been packaged. If you're buying vegetable chips, you do need to double check things because sometimes, they've been fried in oils and fats and lard and things that aren't kosher, but the basic plant is fine. Bugs. Okay. It does say in Leviticus, you shall not eat among all things that swarm upon the earth, which is the biblical term for bugs, anything that crawls on its belly, or anything that walks on fours, or anything that has many legs, for they are an abomination. Going on, it says, technically a little bit before, but these you may eat among all the winged swarming things that walk on all fours, all that have above their feet joined legs to leap with on the ground. Of these you may eat the following: locusts of every variety, but that's biblical variety, not necessarily everywhere in the world. All varieties of bulb locusts, crickets of every variety, and all varieties of grasshopper. Unfortunately, the way that these terms were used in the Bible are not exactly the way these terms are used in common English or in biological classification. That's why you need to consult with an expert before you eat a bug. Those locust types and grasshopper types are kosher, but very few communities still eat them. But if somebody wants to and they are doing the right one, it's kosher. Even if you don't like it, even if you think it's disgusting to eat a bug, you cannot say it's not kosher. It is kosher if it is the right kind. Doesn't mean it has to be in your pantry, but you can't say that it's against the Torah. Fish, like I said, also very broad criteria. These you may eat of all that live in the water. Anything in water, whether in the seas or in the streams, that has fins and scales, needing both of these. These you may eat. But anything in the seas or in the streams that has no fins and scales, among all the swarming things in the water and among all the other living things that are in the water, they are an abomination for you. I should point out, abomination for you doesn't mean they are bad by themselves, right? God is not telling me that dolphins are bad creatures. Nothing wrong with a dolphin. And there is nothing wrong if someone else wants to eat a dolphin, although at the moment, because of dolphin populations and overhunting, generally speaking, killing dolphins for food is not really a good idea. However, it is not in and of itself a bad thing. If somebody who is not Jewish wants to eat oysters in an area where they are plentiful, etc., that's perfectly fine. They have not done anything wrong. God is not angry with them. God is perfectly fine with non-Jews eating all of these things. For us, meaning if you are Jewish and if you are bound thus by the Torah and by the Brit, by the covenant, for us, they are something we should treat as being as far from us as possible when it comes to preparing our menu. So whenever you see the phrase, it's an abomination for you, which is often very misunderstood in modern English, that is what it is trying to tell us. And things that are up in the air, what we would call birds. As you'll know, the category here is a little broader than just birds, because we get a list here in the Torah of birds we cannot eat. The following you shall abominate. Again, you shall treat as, whoa, I'm Jewish, I don't eat that, among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, and the black vulture, the kite, falcons of every variety, all varieties of raven, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, hawks of every variety, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, and the bustard, the stork, herons of every variety, the hopi, the hoopoe, I always get this one wrong, even in the English, and the bat. Again, bats aren't birds, but they are a creature of the air, and so they fall into this category, and they are prohibited. I'm very sorry, you're not allowed to have any bat soup. Because of the nature of the variety of birds, we are given a list of things that we don't eat. However, because of the nature of language, and because of how people will classify certain animals, we are not 100% sure on all of the species in this list, to the point that we can draw a bright, clear line around exactly which ones are off limits. Thus, it is common within the Jewish world to eat birds that we know are safe, which in general is fine. Now, if you ever find yourself without a kosher butcher nearby and without a farm that sells chickens or turkeys, then yes, we can talk a little bit more detail about what other animals might be available in emergency situations. But for most of us these days, it's fine to stick with turkey, chicken, and the occasional duck. And then when we get to land, it's again, like I said, very straightforward. These are the creatures that you may eat from among all the land animals, any animal that has true hoofs, with clefts through the hoof, remember 2 pieces, and that chews the cud, such you may eat. Which means cows, sheep, deer, even a giraffe, and other types of animals that are similar are okay. Pigs, rabbits, camels, cats, squirrels, horses, dogs, guinea pigs, these are not okay. And all of those are eaten in many parts of the world, but not by us. Everyone good so far on all these categories?
Yes.
Okay. But just having the right animal is not enough. As I mentioned before, it also has to be killed, has to be slaughtered and prepared in the right way. So we see from Exodus 22, you shall be holy people to me. You must not eat flesh torn by beasts in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs. This is where we can call it the roadkill issue. If you have a sheep, common in the biblical times, and the sheep has been attacked by a wolf, and the wolf has left the body behind, you might think, well, there's still 50 pounds of meat left on that sheep, so I'll just cut off a little bit, and I'll cook it, and that's going to be for me. And the wolves had their part. Nah. In Judaism, we say, if an animal dies from any reason except proper slaughter, that animal is not kosher. Again, if you're not slaughtering your own animals, you don't really need to worry about this. This will be taken care of by the butcher. As a little aside, the only place where we might have to worry about this is going forward. There have been a number of countries at the moment, mainly in Europe, that have been requiring that all slaughterhouses stun the animal before they perform the slaughter, before they actually kill the animal. And according to most readings of Jewish law, most of the forms of stunning that they are recommending or requiring by law make the animal not okay, because now the animal is being killed or being severely mortally injured by the stunning rather than by the slaughtering that we are required to do. So that in some countries is making it impossible for Jews to be able to prepare their own animals in that country. The most recent was Belgium, that recently passed a law like this. So now they have to import all of their kosher meat from another country because they cannot prepare it in Belgium itself. Nobody has tried to do this yet in the United States, but it is something we have to be aware of that could be an issue in the future. You shall not eat anything that has died a natural death, right? So if it just gets sick and died, you also can't eat it. Give it to the stranger in your community to eat, or you may sell it to a foreigner. If the place where the Lord your God has chosen to establish his name is too far from you, meaning the temple, you may slaughter any of the cattle or sheep that the Lord gives you, as I have instructed you, and you may eat to your heart's content in your settlements. So originally, people all lived near the temple, lived near the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness, and slaughtering it there and sharing it as part of a sacrificial offering was very normal. People did not eat meat as often, and having sacrifices a few times a year for your meat was perfectly reasonable. As the country grew and as people lived further and further and wanted to eat meat more often, going to the temple every time you wanted to have your meat prepared was getting harder and harder. And so the Torah gave us permission in advance so that we would be able to perform the slaughter where we needed to. But as you can see, there is a method for the slaughter. God gave us instructions. Now, those instructions are not written clearly in the Torah because those instructions are the type of instructions that need to be demonstrated. As I've talked about numerous times, hopefully you've heard me before, but if not, this is your first time, you can't teach someone how to drive a car by giving them a book. You have to put them in a car and show them what to do and monitor their progress until they are ready to be on the road by themselves. So too with being a butcher, with being a slaughterer, for killing the animals according to Jewish law. As such, the instructions are considered to be part of the oral Torah, which if you go back to, I think it was class number 2 or number 3, we talked about in much more detail. That this was the verbal set of explanations and instructions that God made sure that Moses knew in order to fulfill the rest of the Torah. Lines like this one here in Deuteronomy 12 are indications that, of course, there had to be additional explanation provided alongside the written text of the Torah itself. So what is the method of slaughter? Well, like I mentioned, to really understand it, you have to learn it and do it. But there are 5 basic requirements that have to be followed in order that the slaughter is correct. You need to watch someone do this and to see it all demonstrated to fully understand, but this at least will give you a basic idea. There should be no interruption of the incision, meaning when the slice happens, it has to be one motion. There should be no pressing of the chalaf, the special word for knife used against the neck. This would exclude use of an axe, hatchet, or guillotine. Right? It's not pushing the knife in, it's pulling the knife across. The chalaf, the knife, should not be covered by the hide of cattle, wool of sheep, or feathers of the bird, and therefore the chalaf has to be of adequate length. You need a very long knife so it's not getting lost inside the material and potentially not completing the cut in the proper way. 4, the incision must be at the appropriate site to sever the major structures and vessels at the neck. It would slice the jugular and the carotid, as well as many of the nerve endings in the neck, so that the animal would lose consciousness as well as its sense immediately. And also, there must be no tearing of the vessels before or during the shtita process. This is one reason why the knife has to be incredibly sharp. We're like a surgeon's scalpel sharp, so that as it goes through, there isn't even a nick on the knife that might be considered a like sawtooth that would be tearing at the animal, but instead it all has to go through perfectly smoothly. And all of those are requirements for the act of slaughter. Once the animal has been slaughtered, as we saw, the blood has to be removed. We can see very clearly Leviticus 7, you must not consume any blood, either of bird or of animal in any of your settlements. Anyone who eats blood shall be cut off from his kin, meaning don't do it. We also are reminded of this in Genesis, in Leviticus 17, as well as in Deuteronomy 12. So that means that all the large vessels in the body, blood vessels in the body are removed. Once that blood has been drained out of it, the meat is also salted and soaked multiple times to draw out any of the extra blood that is in the meat and to then wash it away so that it is not there. Also, broiling freshly slaughtered meat, that is heating it in a special way, causes the blood inside of it to sort of bubble out, and then by rinsing and removing it, the meat also becomes fit. In the modern world, this has been taken care of by modern butchers. But even as going back into like the 1970s and some places even in the 80s, when you bought from the butcher, this would not have been taken care of, and you would have to do all of these steps at home. Meat and milk, as I mentioned. It is said 3 times in the Torah, Deuteronomy 14, Exodus 23, and Exodus 34, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. As we see in Shulchan Aruch, the great law code, the word kid, which means a baby goat, very important in English, right? The word kid doesn't mean child here, it means baby goat, is not specific. It is the same rule with ox, sheep, and goat. And there is no difference if it is the milk of the mother, the actual mother of that actual baby goat, or of another domesticated animal. Rather, the verse refers to the common case. So the Torah will often speak about things that were normal occurrences in the world that the Israelites lived in. So if it talks, for example, about your neighbor's ox attacking your ox, that doesn't mean that if your neighbor's dog attacks your dog, there's no rule. It just means you apply the rule about the ox attacking ox to dogs as well. Why did it talk about oxen? Because that was normal. The same thing with like digging pits and people getting hurt in them, or your neighbor's donkey collapsing under the weight. Those were just normal examples of the broader topics that were being discussed. So too here, even though it's talking about a goat and a mother within the verse, it is not only limited to goats, nor is it only limited to the specific mother's milk. All meat and all milk should not be mixed together and should not be cooked and should not be consumed, not eaten. Now, virgin milk, as Joseph brought up. Well, it is forbidden to eat poultry and milk according to rabbinic law. Now, why is that? Because if you think about it, birds don't make milk, right? Well, birds do not feed their little baby chicks milk. So this doesn't seem like it should apply. And indeed, by the Torah itself, just within the Torah law itself, it does not apply. And if one was to mix chicken and milk by accident, it would be a different mistake than if one was to mix meat, meaning beef and milk. According to rabbinic law, however, we don't do poultry, chicken, duck, turkey, that kind of thing with milk, so that people at large will not be negligent. They won't be careless and come to violate the actual Torah prohibition. Now, what's he talking about here? What he's talking about is how easy it is to mix up the difference between beef, or the difference between meat and chicken meat. Now, if you look at this page, I'm pretty sure that all of you know which one came from the cow and which one came from the chicken, right? Does anybody have a problem identifying the chicken and cow meat? No.
No, that's okay.
How about now? Which one came from the sheep? Which one came from the duck?
Oh my goodness.
Okay, so for most of our history, this is not what our meat looked like, right? Especially back in the days of the Torah, and especially during the days of the rabbi, we did not have beautiful supermarket steak and beautiful supermarket chicken. In fact, chicken wasn't even a common food until very recently for many people. Chicken is relatively recent. In the ancient world, people ate things like pheasant and doves and ducks and birds that have much, much darker colored meat, not the giant, shiny white breast meat, but very dark, gamey bird meat. And likewise, people did not eat beautifully marbled, steak that came from giant cows that have been specially made to give you that kind of meat. They ate from skinny goats and sheep, and those were the main kinds of things they were eating. And they didn't usually get to have giant steaks. They would usually just cut the meat as much as they could and make a stew or make some small amount to eat together with their bigger amounts of bread and vegetables. And thus, poultry and animal meat was very easy to confuse. And so the rabbi said, it's so easy to confuse, just treat the poultry, the bird meat, like you would treat the meat from a cow. And that means it goes into the category of things we don't mix with milk. And we'll be careful about it the same way. And that way, no one will come to make an accident and, God forbid, be violating the Torah. Does that make a little more sense?
Go.
Yes.
Okay. And especially once you start cooking things like by grinding them up and, like I said, putting them into a stew, it's really hard to tell the difference. But for the modern world, we have the option of a hechsher. Right? A hechsher is a very interesting modern convenience and necessity. A hechsher in the modern world is because for the modern world, most of you are probably not producing most of your own food. Right? Hands up, how many of you are actually farmers? How many of you raise your own chickens? How many of you raise your own sheep? How many of you even raise your own carrots or potatoes? Not so many, right? That means we have to buy our food from someone else. Now, we've always done that for a long, long time, thousands of years, but we usually knew the person that we were buying the food from, and they were the ones who made it. My neighbor gave me the eggs. My neighbor gave me the milk. But nowadays, the supermarket gives me my milk. And I don't know who the supermarket bought it from. And I don't know who the factory that produced my cookies bought their things from. And so that means we need a little extra supervision, a little extra investigation to know where the ingredients came from and how they were made into the final product. That additional supervision produces what we call a hechsher, which is a little stamp on the food product to tell us that, yes, this food has been checked and we know it's kosher, even if you've never met the person who made it. So what do we have? We have a whole series of symbols from all the different organizations that send out inspectors to make sure that things are kosher. Some of them are more common than others. So for example, OU is very, very common. Triangle K is very, very common. Kaf K and Triangle CRC, those are also pretty common, at least here in the United States. You go to other parts of the country, other ones are more common. So RCC is out in California. I used to see that one a lot more, not so much here in Florida. Also, I should point out Triangle K. Triangle K is also fine. The reason why some people don't like it has to do more with politics than actually with Jewish law. But if you're ever not sure if something is kosher, what you do is you make a note. What is the name of the product? And then you can text me, or you can email me, or call me, and I'll double check for you and let you know. So if you can't find the symbol on it, just ask me, and I'll be more than happy to give you additional information. Now, when you're looking at the hechsher, you'll also see sometimes there will be a little letter D. So you'll have OU like this, and then right next to it, there'll be a D. That D means this is a dairy product, which is very helpful because sometimes things look like they're dairy and it's dairy. Sometimes things look like they're dairy and they're not dairy, like fake ice cream. Sometimes things look like they're not dairy, like non-dairy creamer, but by Jewish law, they are still dairy. And so having the additional information to tell you whether it is or isn't a dairy product is very, very helpful for making sure you're not mixing the meat and milk together, which we'll talk about how to avoid that mixing in next week's part 2. All right, that brings us to the end for today, however. Still more to go, but that's going to have to wait a week. Any other questions on the topics for tonight? Like I said, we've got a part 2 coming, so if I haven't answered a question begin to talk about, just wait for next week and we'll do it then. And if I still haven't answered it, ask at the end of next week's class. But on tonight's topics, any leftover questions?
Nope.
No, it's
Oh,
okay.
thank you, Rabbi.
All right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all so much. I enjoy teaching you all. Take care and be well.
Thank you, Rabbi. I see you tomorrow.